Once upon a time there was a feel-good refrain, a happy, skippy tune that everybody past a certain age would know and would sometimes find themselves whistling whilst they were changing the oil on the car or waiting in the queue at the post office. The feel-good refrain had a simple way of charming cheer into the whistler or singer within just a few bars, and a lightness of step would follow that, if it hadn't been likely to raise the risk of tripping over in front of the neighbours or the miserable old lady on the post office counter. It might even have developed into a full-on shimmy. Well, maybe. But the feel-good refrain had a big chip on its shoulder. It had once been stolen by a 70s rock band as the basis for a sweeping anthem of a #1 hit. But by the time that every layer had been dubbed and overdubbed and reverb effects added, the simple notes of the light-hearted feel-good refrain had been drowned to death in a crescendo of wailing backing singers, bass effects, and a legendary drum break which had been thumped out on just about every car steering wheel in the land. It had simply got lost in the drama of it all, and now it felt totally redundant. It had never wanted to be dramatic, and it had never wanted to be associated with men in lycra suits and makeup, locked in a crazy pop decade that it felt should be forgotten, a view which many who remembered it would agree with. All this meant that the feel-good refrain was trapped, stuck in a time warp that was not of its making. It felt like a bit of a grubby secret, brought out just for a laugh on karaoke stag nights. And most of all, it had never wanted to be the subject of ridicule. So through no fault of its own, it had ended up having a life that it didn't want. Yes, it was now grand and flashy and glitzy, but it didn't want to be. And so every time it hummed to itself the dozen or so notes that made up its core, it would find itself welling up in the way grandpas who realise that they've missed the best time in their own kids' lives do. And it would choke and not even be able to finish its own song. It felt tragic and wasted and past its sell-by date, and so much less than it had really wanted to be. All its life it had imagined that it might become a simple, soft nursery rhyme that was sung through the generations, from grandmother to grandchild, gently lulling and shushing and sending fragile new lives back to the most magical of sleeps. It had the idea that it had something eternal to offer, something to hand on, like a treasured heirloom that no one even knew the source of, small and precious as a trinket, meaningless to anyone but those who owned it, never defined by one era or society, and flexible enough to find its way into the mental music box of anyone, anywhere. But instead it was stuck in a lycra bodysuit and drowned out in reverb effect. One day it found itself being hummed by a doll-like Chinese classical violin student, in its absolutely purest form, the very way it longed for, the way it had almost given up hope of, as she pottered about her attic loft. This loft was cluttered to the rafters with piles of musical scores and compilations, and a million grubby coffee cups, and a matching set of teacups too. And as she hummed, and the feel-good refrain basked in the joy, the doll-like violinist was shuffling a pile of musical scores, like old family photos or a box of precious keepsakes, carefully laying each one aside to form another pile in the just sufficient space she'd shunted between two other paper mountains. "I think it's you!" And she nursed a piece of sheet music with delight, and leapt over several piles with the expertise of someone who was accustomed to living in artistic chaos. She popped the score onto her music stand, which was shaped like two swans kissing, and which she'd had since her very first violin lesson, when she'd been so small she'd had to stand up on a pile of manuscripts to use it. Chaos can have its uses at times, you see. Anyway, then she played, and she played note perfectly. Yes, she played the very notes she was humming with such an exquisite clarity and lightness that it sent the feel-good refrain surfing off in waves of silent, awestruck paroxysms. It could do nothing else but watch as each note glowed on the page with a sparkling, intense light, like watching a firework trail in a slow-motion movie, or every single degree of a shooting star's course. "Mozart! I knew it!" she exclaimed, and gave a little skip of delight as she went off to make a huge amount of coffee in a receptacle that was vaguely sanitary. She was going to need it, as she'd just been commissioned to compose a piece for a new children's opera with an impossible deadline. Now she had the beautiful hook she needed to fuel her creation. She just needed a bucket-load of caffeine to help her to finish it. All the while she clattered around in her kitchenette, she was still humming, and the still quivering melody stared and gawped at the pattern of black dots and curly swirls dangling from 5 straight lines on the yellowing page. They were all still sparkling, still throbbing, in perfect rhythm with her la-la-lying. The feel-good refrain was seeing its own true energy that it had almost forgotten, given all the overdubbing. And then it heard and saw and felt something even stranger. A decrepit old man who looked like a tramp appeared in a vapour in a corner of the attic. The Chinese girl shivered and closed the skylight and hugged her coffee mug. But she didn't see the weather-beaten tramp man, who looked to the feel-good refrain perhaps very ill, maybe even dying, but who smiled the unmistakable smile of a proud father, maybe a grandfather, perhaps something more. "I found you in a child's song in a meadow," he whispered croakily, "and the part that you have to play may have only just begun," as he disappeared, a wistful whisper. In the half-light of the glowing trail of itself, the feel-good refrain certainly deserved its own name, as it knew that one lifetime locked in a lycra-clad time warp can't have any real effect on a melody that has no beginning or end.